everyone, and welcome to a new video. In today's video, we are going to be making a hat. Specifically a hat to go with this lovely ensemble that I've been working on. It is an 1880s style dress made out of purple cotton velveteen with a contrasting silk underskirt and contrasting silk buttons. It also has a little bow. And I made this mostly off camera because I am horrible about filming things, or at least I have been recently, but I did manage to capture the process of making the hat. This is what the untrimmed hat looks like. I filmed the whole process of making this so you can see how it came together and how you could make something similar to this. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to show the process of trimming it as well, so you can see how it looks all nice and finished. I really hope you enjoy this video, and thanks so much for watching.
So I'm very organized. I have some references up on my computer, which will be linked in the description box down below. I also worked out some measurements, so how big I want the top of the hat to be, how big I want the opening of the hat to be, and then everything else that goes along with that. Over here I have my fabric, the pattern for the top of the hat, the wire and binder clips that will be used to give the hat some structural integrity. Then over here I have the paper for drafting the hat, buckram, interfacing to make the hat, and all of my pretty little potential decorations for the hat. Then all I have to do is actually, make the hat. And to start on that, I've created a mock-up of sorts out of brown paper. And this has just kind of been kludged together. It started out as a rectangle, and then I tapered it to be narrower towards the top, and then I rounded off the edges, and then I folded it into quarters to make sure that it was symmetrical, and then I trimmed some off the top and some off the bottom. And I've just been trying it on after every change and altering it from there until I have something that I'm happy with. I'm not looking my best right now, but that's an idea of what the hat will look like when it's finished. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove all of the tape that is currently holding this together, as well as the binder clips, and transfer this onto new, fresh paper that will then become my pattern for cutting it out of buckram and interfacing. And I'm listening to this podcast while I'm at it. So I didn't actually end up having to transfer it to a new sheet of paper. Once I cut apart my paper mock-up, the paper was actually relatively intact, and I didn't feel like I needed to really smooth out any of the edges. So I just decided to go with it, and I traced around all of these pieces onto the felt bait interfacing, which is what I usually use to make my hats. For this piece, I'm going to sew wire around all of the edges, and I'm also going to sew a band of wire around the center portion of the brim, as well as the center portion at the top of the hat, just to give it a little bit more structural integrity. This is the wire that I'm using, and I'm going to use binder clips to secure it around the outer edge and pins to secure the inner portion of wire, since a binder clip won't be able to reach 3 inches into the center portion of the hat. And I'm going to stitch all the wire down by machine using a zigzag stitch. And then I will be back and show you what it looks like. Alright, so all of the wire has now been sewn in. Last time I made a hat, this hat to be exact, I broke 4 needles during the process because I was not bothering to pin things and just being really quick and rough with the process. And this time I pinned everything, I used binder clips, I really took my time, and I didn't break any needles. So it just goes to show that slow and steady is the way to go. So now I have the top portion just loosely pinned together to get an idea of the shape. I've done the same with the brim, and then I've also just pinned the very top portion of the hat on, so you can see how it looks in all its glory. I'm pretty happy with it. I wish it was a little bit larger so it sat further down on my head, but other than that, I think it's great, and I'm really excited to get back to work on this tomorrow and to start covering it, to start see it coming together. So I guess that's when my next update is going to be, because it's currently 9:30 at night and I don't feel like taking further steps to complete this just now. So I just did a fitting with the hat, and it's actually a little bit small. So I originally added a 1/2 inch to one of the edges, and that was supposed to be the overlap point, so I wouldn't get a point of weakness where the wire ends. I always recommend having your edges overlap to ensure that you don't get those weak points, but to make mine larger, I ended up, instead of overlapping the edges, just whip stitching them together. Now the point where the wire ends on the bottom looks like this, which is not what we want. It's all collapsed in and gross. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of buckram and I'm going to stitch that over top, and that's going to give it some more structural integrity at that point, and it should have a smooth edge around the bottom instead of what's going on right now. For the brim, I'm actually going to cover it before I sew up the edge. So I'm going to remove the binder clips and then stitch the velveteen onto the top layer of it, and I'm going to repeat that process for this little piece, and then I can start fiddling around with lining and stuff like that. I think I will update you once I have the buckram on this, and we'll see how improved it looks, and then I can start cutting out the fabric to actually cover the pieces. So I've officially added the buckram to the crown of the hat, and as you can see, that smoothed it out really nicely. It no longer has the bulging, and the edge is relatively smooth from the bottom. Now I'm repeating this process on the ends of the brim, because since I let this portion out by a ½ inch, I also have to let the brim out by a ½ inch, which I can do pretty easily since I also accounted for a ½ inch overlap. You can see the marking for it on the other side, but since I'm not doing the overlap anymore, since I have to let it out, so the edges are going to meet flush, I'm going to whip stitch them together. I wanted to reinforce these edges too, so I wouldn't get this effect as you see here. So I'm just once again adding more buckram to stiffen those edges. I've already done it on this side, and as you can tell, it's pretty solid and pretty straight, especially compared to this one. So I'm just going to take this folded piece of buckram and pin it over top, and then cut the top and bottom edges to be even with the interfacing brim, and just whip stitch it on there. And then we can start covering the pieces. So I finished sewing all of the buckram, and I just pinned the hat base together to do another try on. Still not perfect, but it's definitely better than it was before, so I'm going to move forward with covering everything. I'm going to use the paper pattern that I originally used to cut out the interfacing and cut about 1 inch away from the edge all the way around the edges of the pieces. So there will be enough seam allowance to tuck the edges over the edge of the interfacing. So that's going to be the next step, and then I want to start just pinning the fabric over top. As you can tell for this part, I've sewn it together before I will be covering it, but for the brim I'm going to be covering it flat just because that makes it a little bit easier. I'm also going to be covering up the top piece of the hat, which you haven't really seen in action yet, but that's where it's going to go. So now I have all of my pieces covered and everything is pinned in place. For the brim, I ended up actually having to pleat the inner edge, which isn't ideal, but that got to cover a lot more smoothly. And from the outside, it looks pretty nice and sharp, but I might actually pull it a little bit more taut there since it's kind of bunching. And then this is the crown portion, and then this is the top portion. I'm just going to go ahead and whip stitch the edges of the velveteen to the interfacing base, and then I can line the hat and then start getting it assembled. So I was just looking through my fabric, which I was going to use for the lining, and I realized I don't have as much fabric left as I thought. So I'm probably only going to be able to line the brim with this fabric, and then I'll have to line the crown with something else. But I think if I sew these two pieces together, I should have enough to line the brim, which is the most important part. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do that quickly, and then I will be back. So now my fabric is sewn together, so I have a large enough piece to cut out my brim lining. So I'm just going to weigh the brim down with some pattern weights and then trace around it and cut around it. And I'm leaving a ½ inch of allowance on the inner edge, which will make it easier to attach to the crown later on. And then I can just cut that out. So I think this portion that I cut out of the center I can use to line the top piece of the hat, which is nice. So now I'm just going to lay the lining on top and pin it so the edges are even. And you want to have that ½ inch allowance around the inner portion, and then I'm going to pin around that as well. So
So now I'm going to measure 1 inch away from the edge of the hat, and I'm going to create little marks on the lining, and that's where I'm going to turn the lining inward. And I'm just using a water-soluble marker for this. So I'm going to be turning the lining inward pretty far away from the edge, just because I want you to be able to see some of that purple around the inner edge of the brim as well. Before I actually turn that edge inward and start sewing it down, I'm going to sew the ends of the brim together so it forms a singular kind of circular shape. I'm just pinning back the lining so I can see those two ends, and I'm just going to whip stitch these together by hand so then it will hold this shape. And now with that done, it looks like this from the outside, nice and clean and finished. So I can just start turning this outer edge inward. And then I'm going to go ahead and line the top portion of the hat too, and just turn the edges of this piece inward as well. Alright, so I've been busy. I've gone ahead and sewed the lining in place around the outer edge of the brim. So that is now complete. So I still have this 1/2 inch allowance of lining on the inner portion, and usually I would clip that and then I would tuck it under and sew it down. But because part of this brim lifts up, you can actually see almost underneath the cap of the hat. So I want the lining to be continuous into the cap of the hat. So I'm actually going to fold this inward to the cap of the hat after I sew the cap on. That is going to be the next step. So now I'm going to sew this edge to the inner edge of my brim. So I'm just going to make sure that the lining is out of the way before I do that. I'm going to remove the pins around the inner portion of the lining on the brim as well, because I want that part to be out of the way. And then I'm going to line up the center front portion of the brim with the center front portion of the crown of the hat. I know I've been calling it a cap, but it's actually the crown. And I'm actually just going to snip into this seam allowance of the lining to make it a little bit easier to turn outward. I'm going to have to clip into it when securing it to the inside of the cap anyway. And now I can try and bring these layers together. So as I said, I'm lining up the center front portion first, and I'm just going to pin through the velveteen to secure the layers together. I may have bent the pin in the process, but success. And I'm just going to go around and continue that process until the crown sits nicely inside of the brim. So now when I turn it over, hopefully you can see where the two edges meet. So this is the edge of the crown, this is the edge of the brim, and I'm just going to whip stitch the layers together at that point. So now we have something resembling a hat. It's all stitched together on the inside. So the next step is just going to be tucking the edges of the lining of the brim inward, and then taking the lining from the crown of the hat and pinning that to the edge of the lining of the brim of the hat. So I'm going to do that now. So I ended up doing most of that off camera because it was a lot more fiddly than I was expecting, but this is what it looked like from the inside. So I just tucked the 1/2 inch seam allowance from the lining of the brim inward, and then I tucked the bottom edge of the lining of the crown inward to cover it. So now it's nice and pinned together, and I'm just going to stitch that together with whip stitches. Then the final step for the base of the hat is just going to be sewing the top on, and then it will be done and we can get to adding decorations, which is probably my favorite part.
So the hat base is officially done. It got a little crumpled when I was trying it on. I definitely should have backed the interfacing with buckram to give it a little bit more rigidity, but it is what it is. It sits on the head like this, so that's why it's tilted. It sits straight when it's on the head. So that's what the interior looks like, all nicely lined, all nicely stitched together. There is some blue residue from the pen around the edge of the brim lining, but that will come off with water, and then I got the top sewn on. So now this just needs decoration. I've got all my decorations over here, not including the seam ripper, but I think I'm actually going to switch focus for the rest of today and work on something else, and then I will come back tomorrow and get this finished.
So it's been about 2 weeks since I filmed anything for this video, but it's time to get it finished, and it's time to finish off this hat. So it looks pretty much like it did last time we talked and last time I updated you. That base is completely finished. It's made out of the purple velveteen on the exterior, and then the interior is lined with silk satin, except for the crown, which was partially lined with velvet because I didn't have enough silk satin to line the whole thing. I also, off camera, sewed 2 combs into the hat, and I can link where I purchased these down below, and that will keep the hat on and keep it positioned properly on my head. If the hat was a little bit larger, it would actually sit on my head, and my head would stabilize the hat, but since I made it a little bit too small, it sits more on top of the hairstyle, and the combs lock into that and keep everything positioned as it should be. And here's my not so little caddy of goodies. I've got 2 ostrich plumes, one that matches the fabric and one that matches some of the millinery flowers that I would like to use. And then I have some smaller feathers which kind of match the satin that I used for this project. I also have these little bundles of feathers, and then I have a bunch of vintage velvet millinery things, along with scraps left over from making the underskirt and lining, so I could potentially have a band going around the hat. Though I'm not sure that I want to do that. That was kind of my original plan, but now I'm thinking of going in a different direction. Oh, and then I also have a hot glue gun, but recently I've been trying to sew as many feathers and things on as I can instead of gluing, so I have a needle and some thread as well. And even though all of these things are very important in the process of hat making or hat trimming, I think the most important thing is the mirror. It's very important to constantly be trying on the hat and looking at different angles and making sure that the feathers aren't overwhelming the shape of the hat, but that they're adding to it nicely. And I feel like you can't really tell or get a good idea of that without the context of the hat being placed on a head. So my hat trimming strategy is usually to start from the left side of the hat because I generally pose with my left side facing the camera. So I want the most fun part of the hat to be on that side. And generally I start with feathers since they are the largest trims that I will consider adding. So I'm just going to begin by placing this feather at an angle that I think is quite nice and then just pinning it on. And this is one of those cases where it's good to try it on because the feather kind of distorts the shape of the crown of the hat, which sometimes I want, especially with Edwardian hats, but sometimes I want the shape that I've worked so hard to create to be more defined and more visible. And in that case I would cut the feather so it's shorter and it doesn't have as much coverage. So I'm going to try this on, and I feel like it's a little bit too long. There's kind of this awkward point where it flips over the top of the hat. Another feather option I have is this darker purple one, and I might actually use both of these. So I think I'm going to try trimming this darker feather down to the length I want for this project and seeing how that looks. And that just kind of blends in with the fabric, so I don't know if I love how that looks, but I definitely like that length of feather a little bit more. I think I'm going to use both feathers and stack them. I'm just going to cut about an inch of length off of the longer one. So I think they need to be moved a little bit further over to this side. Pretty happy with this placement, and before sewing them I'm just going to play around with some other possible additions. Also, something I forgot to mention at the beginning is that I always mark the center front of the hat so that I can consistently try it on in the correct orientation and really get an idea of how it will look when positioned properly on my head. So I've got these things I was really hoping to incorporate. They're fake grapes made out of velvet, and then they've got the really interesting vine swirls as well as some leaves. So I was thinking I could sort of have these cupping the base of the brim and creeping around to the front. But then the other option I have are these, which are more like spindly looking flowers, and the base for these is a more vibrant green color, which kind of goes with the vibrancy of the silk I used for this, but this has a more muted yellow in it, which is actually more similar to the color. So not sure which of these I'm going to go with. I'm trying to make this video a little bit different from the hat tutorials I've made in the past and give you some insights into my thought process instead of just like how you do it, because no one is making this exact same hat using the exact same pattern. So I think it's better to give you things that you can take into your hat making adventures instead of just being very kind of stiff with the instructions. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I have lots of videos like that, so I can't judge. Even though I really like these, after trying it on, they look a little bit heavy. So I might be able to get away with just using one of them. That looks way better, but I feel like it needs to be moved more towards the front. And possibly even the feathers need to be moved more towards the front too. So I'm really happy with how that looks, but I don't want to discount these just yet. So I might try seeing how it looks with this too before I move forward with this design. I think I like how this looks more, but I don't like how it looks within the costume. I think the grapes suit the overall color better. So then the last thing I really want to consider is potentially using a contrasting color of feathers, like one of these yellow swirls that I have. I think that looks really cool, but it will look cool when I try it on. That's the thing, you never know. I'm still not sure about the yellow burst of feathers, but I think I've finalized the placement of the ostrich feathers. So I'm just going to go ahead and take my thread and sew them on so they will be secured in this position forever. And I'm just using a few whip stitches to secure the feathers. If you're using bigger feathers that have a really strong stem in them, you can actually split the stem in half using scissors or a chisel and then wrap the thread in and out of the split center of the feather. And I find that creates a really, really strong hold on the feathers. So I like doing that under certain circumstances, but it's not really applicable here since these are relatively small feathers, or at least the stem of the feathers is quite small. And the most annoying part about sewing feathers on is trying not to get the plumes caught in the thread as you're sewing. So with that done, I can think about adding my millinery flower slash cluster of grapes. It's not really a flower. And I'm going to spread this out a little bit more. And then I'm going to pin it on one final time and do another try on just before sewing it in place. And now this is going to get sewn on as well. I'm just going to sew around the branches to the best of my ability. And that is how it looks. So I'm going to do one more try on and then potentially play around with the idea of adding in some yellow feathers. Another yellow feather option that I have are these goose feathers. So I might just try cutting a couple of these off and playing around with the placement of them. These feathers are actually mounted on trim, so they can be sewn in a strip onto something, but when I'm using them for hats and stuff, I usually just clip them off of the trim. These could kind of go in behind the grapes if I wanted them to, and add in some of that yellow, but not as dramatically as the little poof of ostrich feathers that I have. So let's see what that looks like when it's on. So I really like how this looks. I actually think it adds a lot to the hat, but I do think that these are too long. I'm going to try and place them in the same spot, but just trim maybe 2 inches off the bottom of each one. It took about 10 minutes of fiddling, but I finally found an orientation of feathers that I like. I do think the yellow adds a lot to it. So I'm just going to tack these on with one stitch, like one stitch for each feather, which isn't going to do a whole lot to secure them, but hopefully it will be enough. Glue would actually be more secure for this type of feather, but they're kind of hidden behind the millinery floral thing, and I don't want to get glue all over the back of that. So that is the finished hat. I don't know if this angle is really doing it justice. My hair isn't styled quite appropriately. The 1890s or 1880s hair I'd wear this with would be up and quite heavily curled. It would be some sort of updo. So the hat would sit really nicely on top of that. And then that is what it looks like from the side. I apologize for the shaky camera. It's very heavy and difficult to hold this way. And I think that finishes off this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for your support. I will talk to all of you very soon.